All right, I think we can get started. So hi everyone, welcome to this webinar. I can't see who's on the call live, but if you have any questions or comments and want to reach out, please put them in the chat, and we will either take them as we're going through or catch up towards the end of this webinar. We're going to talk today about how building energy reporting can pave the way to lower bills. I'm Brendan Place. I'm the operations lead and a climate action consultant for Climate Action. Just to give you a bit more background about myself, I'm a mechanical engineer. I spent several years doing design engineering, a few years working for Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources on their renewable and energy efficiency team, mostly dealing with building energy efficiency and building decarbonization, and then several years as a sustainability consultant. So during this talk, we're going to give a quick introduction to building energy reporting standards, why they're important and why we are facing them today. Then we will go into building energy reporting standards that are relevant to us in Massachusetts. We will review some pathways to compliance, and then we will highlight our approach at Climate Action. So we are Climate Action. We are an independent employee-owned and B Corp certified company. We really focus on making a significant impact through mainstreaming climate action for businesses. We are based out of Cork, Ireland. We were founded 4 years ago, and we recently opened an office in Boston to bring our operations to the US and expand our impact. There's about 7 of us here. And we are very excited to collaborate with local companies. So just a quick intro to why building energy reporting is important. So when we look at our country, state, city GHG emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, we see that buildings take up a significant portion of our emission portfolio. And so there is a way to address new construction. New buildings that are going in, we can update building energy codes. There are some areas where they're banning fossil fuels or requiring electrification readiness or rooftop PV. So we can address new buildings, and we are having much more efficient new buildings. But existing buildings remain the largest portion of our building emission portfolio, and they are difficult to address. And so, building energy reporting is going to be a key lever to start decarbonizing these assets. And so that's been identified, at the state level, at the city level, and that's why these building energy reporting requirements have come about. And so just kind of to highlight this a bit more, we see that building energy reporting is kind of becoming popular throughout the United States. In cities all over the country, and it usually starts as a benchmarking or disclosure requirement, just to disclose data. A lot of times it's only applicable to a portion of the building portfolio for the state or city, but then it expands over time, and it moves from a disclosure requirement to a reporting and performance requirement. And so that's when we're getting, it's to get building owners and those that are required to report used to kind of collecting this data and going about the process. And then there, is that shift from reporting to performance. I just wanted to highlight, this reporting requirement ends up disclosing a lot more information that we haven't had before. So by reporting, we're able to access, publicly data for buildings across the states or the cities or wherever they're being disclosed. I ran this study several years ago with some colleagues at Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, where we were trying to understand the impact that certain green building certifications have on actual energy performance. And it was challenging because there are only really 2 sources we could access public data, and that was this Pennsylvania affordable housing study. So it was a really limited pool to just affordable housing in multifamily housing in Pennsylvania. And then in Boston, the BERDO data was publicly available. We were able to cross-reference that with like LEED certified buildings and Passive House certified buildings, and then pulled together this assessment comparing Passive House to LEED to standard building code. And it was really insightful for us because it did show that there are certain building standards and certifications that we think are high performing, but they really address other aspects of sustainable building rather than just energy performance. Also, by disclosing all of this data, or by collecting all of this data, our building owners and managers can now have a whole portfolio assessment. Sometimes, companies are siloed to their different pockets. So you have a facilities team in charge of these 3 buildings, facilities team in charge of these 3 buildings. And so now you can look at your whole portfolio, and you can identify kind of the leaders, the laggards. You can start using this as a tool within your own portfolio to see what's been successful and what buildings do we need to improve. So now we'll jump into the building emission reporting standards that are relevant to Massachusetts. So we have BERDO, which is Boston's, we have BEUDO, and we have a new large building energy reporting requirement. So jumping right into BERDO. So this is Building Energy Reporting Disclosure Ordinance. It was founded in 2013 as a purely reporting requirement. So this was just buildings that were supposed to report their energy usage. Over time, this converted to a performance requirement. That's what BERDO 2.0 is. It was that transition from a reporting requirement to a performance requirement. And so what we're seeing in the year 2050, so the goal is to get to net zero by 2050. What we're seeing in 2025 is this is the first year that a portion of the buildings have to meet a performance requirement. And so that's all buildings over 35,000 square foot or residential buildings with more than 35 units. And there will be another bucket of buildings that are the 20 to 35,000 square foot and the 15 to 34 unit residential buildings, which will need to come into compliance with that performance standard by 2030. And so just to highlight why this is important, beyond getting knowledge of our buildings, there are going to be fines associated with not achieving these performance requirements, and they can be fairly significant, especially when looking at the fines over like the course of the period of non-compliance. So these fines can be anywhere from $230 to $1,000 per day. And so we do have an example of a building that is out of compliance, and we can see that the cumulative cost of being out of compliance is about $1.3 million during that time period. And I think that's really powerful because we can see if we were to plan that $1.3 million into capital investments, we could likely save a lot of money, be in compliance, and have a better building. So this is just to highlight that BERDO and BEUDO have different standards for different building types, and so the different standards are recognizing that different buildings are more or less energy intensive, but the target is still to get to that net zero by 2050. So BEUDO is very similar to BERDO. There's a few additional nuances. One specific one is that buildings over 100,000 square foot have a much more accelerated decarbonization requirement, so they have to be to net zero by 2035. And they have slightly different requirements for who must comply. So, it's residential buildings 50 or more. I think it's unique that they're requiring municipal buildings at a smaller size to report as well. And the fine structure is also fairly similar to the BERDO system. So BEUDO is specific to Cambridge, whereas BERDO is specific to Boston. And finally, I just wanted to introduce this large building energy reporting requirement. This is from Massachusetts. It's run by Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, and this is just the first stage. This is all buildings 20,000 square foot or greater are going to have to report their energy usage starting this year. And so these buildings, for anyone in Cambridge or Boston, this will be, fairly straightforward because these buildings have already been reporting. But for the rest of the state, it's going to be a bit of a collaborative approach between the utilities and the building owners to report this data. So the utilities are supposed to report the electricity, natural gas, or steam consumption, and the buildings will need to disclose any additional energy they use. So if they're buying distributed energy like oil or propane, or have biomass on site, they will need to disclose their energy consumption from those sources. And so just one more piece kind of tying all this together is that industry leaders in the real estate investment area or asset holders are increasingly requiring or focusing on physical risk management. And one way they're doing that is by setting science-based targets and aligning with a 1.5 degree or 2 degree decarbonization pathway. And in order to identify that they are meeting these standards, they commit to that science-based target, or they commit to both the science-based target and this carbon risk real estate monitor. And so this carbon risk real estate monitor aligns very closely with the BERDO and BEUDO standards. And so if a building is achieving BERDO, then it would likely be achieving the CREM pathways. And so by achieving BERDO, you can add these certifications or these commitments to show that you are also a leader for this asset or this portfolio share. So now we'll shift into pathways to compliance. So I think kind of before going into the specifics about pathways, I think it's really important to identify that, getting into this reporting requirement and starting to think about how your buildings perform is a really great opportunity to get buy-in from leadership and owners. So a lot of times, utilities and these operational expenses are managed by a facilities team, or they're managed by an energy team or an operations team. But now, looking at whole portfolios and having to be within compliance and having, concern about fees, we see that, leaders and owners are having to start thinking about this. It's an opportunity for these facility teams or energy teams that may have wanted to improve some capital systems or wanted to get buy-in for energy efficiency upgrades, can now get that buy-in that they've been looking for and kind of have a leg to stand on if they haven't had one so far. I also think, before we talked about how you can compare your own buildings to each other, having all of this publicly available data, we can see how your buildings would compare to competitors. You can do benchmarking. That's particularly valuable if you're thinking about buying or selling assets. All of this is going to be publicly available. It could be a competitive advantage when you're looking for leasing. There's a lot of good opportunities to leverage this data towards action. And I think one more piece is that it's going to require owners and operators to take initiatives and to start adopting energy efficiency and decarbonization strategies. So just before we jump into some of the solutions, I just wanted to kind of give a high-level overview of the problem we're facing. So we have, we think about energy as, electricity. the fuels we consume on site, but really buildings, we got to think about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 are all of the emissions that we release at our site or through our owned assets. So that could be refrigerants that are leaking. It could be the fuels we're combusting on site. For some of the industrial clients, it could be processes that are releasing different emission sources. And it also includes the fleet. And then scope 2 is all the energy that's produced offsite that we use on site. And so for Boston and Cambridge, that's going to include steam and any district cooling that you're able to access. But for most buildings, it will mostly refer to electricity. And scope 3 is something that's a bit out of this purview, but just to kind of highlight what it is. Scope 3 are the indirect emissions that come from your supply chain, the things you buy, the services you contract with, upstream and downstream. It could be waste. But so for BERDO, BEUDO, large building energy reporting requirements is really a scope 1 and 2 focus. And so just looking at what a building in Boston might look like, there's going to be a large share of scope 1 emissions and a large share of scope 2 emissions. And I want to highlight this because scope 2 emissions are going to continue to decrease over time as our grid decarbonizes. And so Massachusetts has a legislated requirement to reduce their electrical grid emissions to it's a virtual net zero by 2050. And so what we know will happen is scope 2 will continue to go down over time. That doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for energy efficiency improvements and things like that, but we know that scope 2 will go down over time. However, scope 1 emissions, which come from combustion of fossil fuels, we have to find an alternative. They will, we're not going to add renewables to the fossil fuel network. And so the emission factors of fossil fuels will stay flat, and we'll have to find opportunities to decarbonize that fossil fuel to achieve, decarbonization goals, but also to be within compliance of BERDO, BEUDO in the future. So some of these decarbonization solutions that I wanted to highlight, and I have it categorized in this way because they kind of, so as we're addressing energy efficiency, these are going to be kind of the low-hanging fruits, the opportunities to save money, the opportunities to save operating expenses. Some of them are going to be low or no cost. And it's really, it's something that if we look at the history of Massachusetts, different energy efficiency programs have really targeted some of these. And so a lot of buildings have adopted them. But it's, surprising how many buildings still have opportunities to do things like add LED lighting or incorporate building occupancy sensors or daylighting in the lights. These are, really short payback initiatives that have, a large impact. Some other really important ones are, having a strong building control system, setting up an energy management system. That might be a zero cost initiative. It's building, there's no capital investment. It's just, improving your own energy management practices. There are some energy efficiency initiatives that are going to cost money, but they might be critical for adopting electrification in the future. And so that's, your envelope improvements. It is fairly expensive to go and replace your windows on a 12-story building. To do a full facade replacement is fairly expensive, but there are opportunities to go through and add insulation, do air sealing, replace specific doors or leaky failing windows that can save some of that cost. But envelope improvements may be necessary to integrate air source heat pumps in the future, because air source heat pumps they operate differently than fossil fuel consumption systems. So kind of, energy efficiency is going to be the first place. Electrification would be the next target. This is adopting, replacing those scope 1 emissions, those fossil fuel generators with electrification. This is going to be needed to hit the 2050 target. There really there are some thoughts around using different fuels or having carbon capture on facilities, but what we know of the technology today, there are going to be limits to that. And we know that there are feasible opportunities today to adopt air source heat pump, ground source heat pump water heaters. Electric boilers can be a bit niche because they do have a fairly high operating expense. They don't have the benefit of the efficiency from air source heat pumps or other heat pump technologies. I wanted to talk about the fuel switching opportunities like biomass, biogas, green hydrogen, other biofuels. There are opportunities for this, but biomass, biogas, biofuels, they still have some emissions associated with their operations. So, depending on the source of the biomass or the biogas or the biofuels, you might only get a 40% emission reduction. You might only get a 60% emission reduction. There are very few instances where you're going to be able to say this is fully renewable. Biomass, if it's fully from waste, then we know that it's an emission-free source. Biogas, there are some streams where it could be emission-free, but there's going to be limits there. And I think what's really critical about this is how you're getting these to your site, and is there supply available? And so these would be great drop-in solutions, but a lot of times the supply is very limited in the region. And if we look at it, over time, we're going to have, for sure, biogas and green hydrogen and biofuel shortages where we couldn't shift our entire portfolio to these fuels in the future. I wanted to highlight, after we do a new energy efficiency and electrification, that's where we would look at, procuring renewables. Renewables come with, if we're not installing them on site, they're going to come likely with a cost increase. So right now, BERDO and BEUDO require you to either buy Class 1 RECs or you need to buy renewables from like an additional source. It has to be new renewables. And so you can get a PPA or a power purchase agreement, a virtual power purchase agreement, community solar, but it has to come from a new source of renewables, so a new installation. Right now, the Class 1 RECs, you can go out and buy them. They're about $30 per megawatt hour, which would factor in to be about a 3 cents per kilowatt hour premium on your electricity price, which can be pretty significant if you have to buy, millions of kilowatts of electricity. And finally, I just wanted to talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I think it's something that people think about. But when we are actually considering this technology, we have to see where it's been applied. And for the most part, carbon capture, utilization, and storage is applied on really, really large single stacks, so single emission sources. And for reference, some of the smallest systems I've seen need something like 20,000 tons a year of carbon emitted for them to be viable, and most of them need to be more in the 50 to 100,000 ton range. And so I want to highlight that because carbon capture is likely not going to be a solution on our buildings, at least not with the technology we have today. That could change over time. But one more important thing is that we have to figure out how to either use that carbon or store it somewhere else. Otherwise, we're just releasing it back into the atmosphere in a different way. And the technology, does capture carbon, but it's only capturing it at 60 to 85%. So we are still releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and we're not getting to that 100% decarbonization. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can turn this into, a long-term pathway for compliance and what buildings should consider as they're going through this journey. So, the first step is going to be making sure that you are within compliance of this reporting requirement. And then it's really, really important to get a detailed energy efficiency and carbon assessment. And so, a lot of people are aware of energy efficiency assessments. Factoring in that carbon piece can be new for a lot of the energy engineers that are out there. It's really, really important for the next phase, which is, developing a short and long-term strategy for adoption. and implementation. And I think one piece here that's really important is that when you're considering this strategy, you need to make sure that you factor in, your next 1 to 5 year plan for capital investment. Do you know that is there capital equipment that's failing? Do you have a boiler that you've had to put more maintenance into than you had planned? Is there a CHP system that is much more costly to operate than you realized? Do you have a plan to replace your facade in the next 3 years or your roof in the next 3 years? When you start factoring these in, it makes energy efficiency and decarbonization opportunities much more viable, because you're already spending the money there. There's usually, minimal to little cost premium if you start, thinking about adding some insulation during that roof replacement, and it can make the costs really pencil out. So kind of after developing this long-term strategy, factoring in all of those future projects and kind of plan for your asset, then you would look into implementing the low and no cost energy efficiency levers. So this would be the lighting improvements, the building automation improvements. It might be changing your occupancy settings, doing some light air sealing, improving like doing some sealing of your ducting if you have that for your heating distribution. Kind of going through all of these initiatives and adopting low or no cost measures. And from our experience, we find that most buildings, even buildings that have gone through retro commissioning in the last 5 years, there's still opportunity for 10 to 20. We've even seen opportunities for 20+% energy and emission reduction through these low or no cost initiatives, and that's really valuable, because if we make sure we account for that in this step, and we account for the savings that we're getting from these low or no cost initiatives, it makes some of the more expensive initiatives more attractive if we're considering it all within the same strategy. And so that next step is then to go into adopting, enabling larger capital and energy efficiency projects. And so that would be those envelope improvements that might be needed for a heat pump installation, or it could be we're going through our ducting and replacing a lot of it because it's oversized, or we need to replace some of our piping because we designed it for a high temperature water loop and we need to replace it with a lower temperature water loop. So it's kind of taking those lower no cost initiatives and helping you to pay for these larger capital projects. The next step would be to electrify everything everywhere you can. And so this again is, air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, air to water heat pumps, and air heat pump water heaters. And it might be, electric boilers if you're in specific applications where you need to. Yeah, and then so finally it's to, after you've done all this, how much electricity you're using, and so then you would be looking at procuring renewable electricities to offset the remainder of your emissions. And finally, you would report these results. Make sure you're tracking it, because understanding your performance is really important. I did want to highlight that there are significant incentive opportunities and financing opportunities throughout the state. I also wanted to highlight that there are federal incentives. We do recognize that there, in the current administration, there is uncertainty around if these tax credits will be around, but I think it's still valuable to identify them. Experienced tax professionals should understand if these are able to be leveraged this year or next year, and they can be really significant. 30% of the capital cost, 50% of the capital cost in specific instances. So, it's really important to make sure we're considering all the federal incentives. But the state of Massachusetts has one of the best energy efficiency funds in the country. And so it's a great resource to leverage for, these efficiency projects. And so kind of the first step, and I think the most important step, is to, commercial buildings have a utility partner. Working with that utility representative and the Mass Save program to identify commercial building programs they can leverage. So a lot of times the way to leverage this there's not a prescriptive amount. It's really custom for each building. And so you have to have that relationship. You need to go speak with these utility representatives and kind of talk to them about your ideas, your project, try to get buy-in from the Mass Save program. And you can really leverage pretty significant incentives through that. I also wanted to highlight that the EEA, Massachusetts EEA, is developing a building decarbonization clearinghouse. So this is a resource to help consider your building over time and all the incentives that you can apply to it, both from the state, the federal government, the different programs available. I also wanted to highlight there's a unique financing program run by Mass Development. It's called Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. It allows asset holders to take a lien out against their property. So rather than it being a loan, it's a lien to the property to finance energy efficiency projects, as long as the savings to investment ratio is greater than 1. So that would mean, over the life cycle of the entire investment, as long as you're getting more savings than it cost up front, you can access this lien. And so the value to that is if you're only planning to hold an asset for 3 or 4 years, you can apply a lien to it and it can carry over to the next building owner. I also wanted to highlight the alternative portfolio standard and the renewable portfolio standard. These are opportunities to get a credit-based incentive if you're generating heat, which would be the alternative portfolio standard, from clean heating sources like biomass or air source or ground source heat pumps. And finally, I wanted to highlight that Massachusetts has launched a green bank. It's mostly, at least from my understanding, it's mostly focused on affordable housing, but I do think there are opportunities to access financing through that. I also wanted to highlight that there's plenty of resources on the BERDO website to kind of talk through some of these strategies. You can see how your building's performing. You can see how it forecasts into the future from a compliance standard. And there's really valuable resources to leverage from Boston's BERDO website. Finally, I wanted to get into our approach and show kind of a case study of a success we've had. So at Climate Action, we've standardized an approach to energy and carbon auditing. And so, we take an approach that's fast. We do a footprint. We get a detailed footprint of your building. For BERDO and BEUDO buildings, it'd be relatively quick. We could leverage the data that's available. And then we take that data and we'll audit your facility for metering opportunities, for we'll review the building for occupancy. We will identify as many opportunities for decarbonization as we can. During that phase, we'll also price out the different initiatives that we're identifying, and then we will take all those initiatives, we will partner with you and try to pull together a strategy for implementation. And then finally, we work with your team to identify if there's opportunities for maybe energy management training or training for carbon accounting that we can help your team improve on. And then we have a model where we would actually help you implement these projects. We call it Climate Action as a Service. And this would be where we could support you 1 to 5 days a week to go through those initiatives we identified in the audit and help you implement them. And so through this approach, we wanted to highlight one of our case studies. So this is a Massachusetts-based manufacturing facility. It spends millions of dollars a year on energy, and we were brought in to help develop a decarbonization strategy. And so through this, case study, we identified, something like 150 initiatives that the facility could adopt across all their buildings and all their assets. From this, audit map, we after going through the strategy and figuring out what they would actually adopt, we identified that it would cost about $10 million 60% of the carbon savings would be possible with the return on investment. And to get to that, 2050 target, in adopting all these initiatives, it would have about a 5-6 year payback. And so just kind of wanted to go a little bit more in depth here. This is an example of the output. We again have our scope 1 and 2 split. We took all those initiatives. Our goal was, again, to try to identify as many opportunities that were low cost, that would address electricity consumption, and then as many opportunities as we could to get rid of scope 1 emissions. And so, from this study, we identified all these opportunities. And before, adopting renewable electricity, we were getting to about a 60% reduction. And then after renewables, we were getting to about a 95% reduction. There still is a remaining source of emissions because they have unique processes that currently require, fossil fuels. But it is something that we would continue to partner with them to figure out if there's alternatives. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening to my talk. If you have any questions, I don't see anything in the comments, but I'm not sure. Do we know how anyone can ask questions? Okay, we'll give that a minute, and if we don't get anything, my contact information is on the screen. Please feel free to reach out with any questions about partnership or questions you have from the presentation. Yep. Yeah, Ben, thank you for the question. So for real estate investment trusts or asset holders with buildings outside of the state, there's going to be different compliance requirements. It doesn't mean that you couldn't take the approach that you're taking to comply with BERDO or BEUDO. You can still do energy efficiency assessments. I would say that it is really important for asset holders with a diverse national building portfolio to make sure you're taking you're assessing them in each of the different regions. And that's really important. In the United States, we have several different climate zones, and these can really impact the operations of a building. So for instance, down in Florida, there really isn't much need for heating. So we don't have as many of those scope 1 emissions. So there's different strategies you would take to decarbonize that building. Similarly, in certain states, we have really, really dirty electricity still. And so it might mean you don't take that shift to electrification until you're ready for your renewable procurement. So there's, maybe not a one-size-fits-all approach, but I do think the pathway that we laid out would be, a clear strategy to help decarbonize those out-of-state assets. All right. Well, I don't think we're getting any more questions, but thank you very much for taking the time to, hear this webinar.